There's a hostile man here, refusing to give me access to community property. Send officers immediately. I think he's dangerous." The voice on the other end of my phone, which I'd started recording, was shrill and filled with a manufactured panic. I stood on my own porch, holding nothing more threatening than a lukewarm coffee, and watched HOA President Karen clutching her pearls as if she'd just cornered a felon. The absurdity was breathtaking. She wasn't just on my property. She was demanding the keys to my family's lake cabin, claiming the HOA needed them for emergency access. My refusal had triggered this meltdown. Little did she know, her frantic 911 call wasn't just a ridiculous abuse of power. It was the final, glorious nail in the coffin she'd been building for herself for months. How do you deal with a neighbor who thinks your home is her playground? Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, because this story gets absolutely crazy. My grandfather, a man who believed calloused hands were a sign of a life well lived, built the cabin with his own 2 sons, back in the late 1960s. It wasn't a mansion, just a sturdy, honest structure of cedar and stone, nestled in a cove on a lake that was, back then, considered the middle of nowhere. He wasn't a professional builder. He was a civil engineer for the state, a man who understood load-bearing walls, the importance of a solid foundation, and the precise, unyielding language of property deeds and survey maps. He taught me how to read a compass before I could properly read a book, and how to understand the topography of the land by walking it. The cabin was his sanctuary, and it became mine. Every summer of my childhood was spent there, learning to fish off the small wooden dock, identifying bird calls with my grandmother, and listening to my grandfather's stories on that porch. The land itself, a little over 3 acres wrapping around the shoreline, was as much a part of my identity as my own name. When he passed, the cabin and the land were left to me, not as a piece of real estate, but as a custodianship. He left me all his meticulous records too. The original deed from 1967, survey maps stamped by the county, blueprints he'd sketched himself on drafting paper that was now yellowed and brittle. They were historical artifacts of a family's dream. For years, I kept it just as he had, a rustic escape from my life as an architectural historian, a job that, fittingly, involved peeling back the layers of buildings to understand their true stories. The nearest neighbors were a quarter-mile away, and the concept of an HOA was as foreign as a traffic jam. That all changed about 5 years ago. A developer bought the large tract of woodland behind our cove and put in a high-end subdivision they called Lakeside Estates. Suddenly, my quiet refuge was flanked by sprawling, cookie-cutter homes, with manicured lawns that ran right down to the newly installed riprap shorelines. With the new development came the inevitable homeowners association, a necessary evil, I supposed, to keep the new streetlights working and the communal boat ramp maintained. Because my property predated the development, I wasn't automatically a member, but the developer's lawyers had cleverly worded the sale of the surrounding land to create a sort of associate membership for the few original properties, like mine, that were now islands in their sea of beige vinyl siding. It was an opt-in arrangement for using their amenities, like the new tennis courts and pool, for a modest annual fee. I politely declined. I had a lake. I didn't need a pool. I had 3 acres of woods. I didn't need a tennis court. I had my grandfather's dock. The conflict was baked in from the start, I see now. My property was an anomaly, a rustic patch of authenticity in their manufactured paradise. The very existence of my weathered cedar cabin seemed to offend their aesthetic sensibilities. Then came Karen. Karen Miller wasn't just a resident of Lakeside Estates. She was its self-appointed queen. She drove a pristine white Range Rover, the kind that had never seen a speck of mud, and her entire persona seemed engineered to project an air of effortless superiority and oppressive cheerfulness. She was elected HOA president within a year of moving in, a position she wielded not as a duty, but as a scepter. Our first real interaction was innocuous enough, a harbinger of the insanity to come. I was restaining the porch, a biennial ritual my grandfather had taught me. Karen pulled up in her golf cart, which was also a matching pristine white, her visor perfectly angled, a clipboard resting in the passenger seat. "Oh, hello there," she called out, her voice a little too loud. "Just doing a little community beautification. We're so glad you're finally sprucing the old place up a bit." We were getting a tad concerned about the rustic look. I paused, paintbrush in hand. "It's a log cabin, Karen." "The rustic look is sort of the point." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face before being replaced by a tight smile. Of course. Well, just make sure that stain color is on the pre-approved palette. We wouldn't want to get a notice, now would we?" She gestured vaguely toward her clipboard. "I'm the HOA president, you know." I just stared at her. "Karen, I'm not in the HOA. Your pre-approved palette doesn't apply to this property. This cabin was here before your parents were born." Her smile tightened another notch. "Well, we're all one big community now. We have standards to maintain. A rising tide lifts all boats, you know." She said it as if it were a profound piece of wisdom she had personally coined. That was the beginning. From then on, she made it her personal mission to bring my property into her fold. She left notes on my door about the length of my grass, which was a natural meadow, not a lawn, the unapproved model of my grill, and the unsightliness of my woodpile. Each note was laminated. Who laminates passive-aggressive notes? It was a level of petty dedication that was almost impressive. The real trouble, however, began with the path. Along the edge of my property, bordering the new development, was a faint trail, a deer path really, that wound through the woods down to the shoreline. The new residents had started using it as a shortcut to the lake. I didn't mind. They were generally respectful, and it was far enough from the cabin that it wasn't a bother. But Karen saw it differently. In her mind, that deer path was a designated community nature trail, and that trail, she decided, needed to be improved. It also, in her imperial imagination, didn't stop at the edge of my property but continued right across my land, past my woodpile, and onto the flagstone patio beside my cabin. The escalation was gradual at first, a slow simmer that I foolishly believed would eventually cool down. It started with an official-looking letter, printed on HOA letterhead, and slipped into a plastic sleeve protector tucked under my cabin's doorknob. The letter, signed by Karen as president and head of community standards, informed me of the upcoming improvement project for the Lakeside Community Trail. It detailed plans to widen the path, lay down gravel, and install small wooden signs every 50 feet, with folksy, inspirational quotes on them. The letter ended with a cheery, "We'll be starting the survey work next week, and would appreciate you ensuring your pets are secured and any personal items are cleared from the trail's right-of-way." The phrase, "right-of-way," was underlined twice. This was the first time she had committed her delusion to paper. I walked the path later that day. The deer trail she was referring to was clearly on my property. It ran a good 70 yards inside my boundary markers, which were old but clearly visible, iron stakes my grandfather had driven into the ground decades ago. Her imagined right-of-way cut directly across my firewood storage area and ended less than 30 feet from my back door. I wrote a polite, simple reply. I explained that the path was on my private property, that there was no right-of-way or easement on my deed, and that while I didn't mind residents using the existing trail respectfully, any improvement project was out of the question. I delivered it to the HOA's official mailbox, making a point to take a photo of it resting inside before I closed the lid. I thought that would be the end of it. A simple clarification. A boundary drawn, literally and figuratively. I had underestimated the potent blend of ignorance and arrogance that fueled Karen. A few days later, I was on my porch when I saw two men with surveying equipment walking along the path. They had already driven several new wooden stakes into the ground, complete with bright pink flagging tape, marking the proposed new 3-foot-wide trail. Their path veered directly toward my cabin. I walked out to meet them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The younger of the two looked up, surprised. "Oh, hey, we're with County Line Surveying, just marking out the new trail for the HOA." "I see that," I said calmly. "The thing is, you're on private property, and the person who hired you doesn't have the authority to commission work here." The older surveyor A man, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor, lowered his transit and looked at me, then at his work order. Says here, this is Lakeside Estates community property. Work order signed by Karen Miller, HOA president. I smiled faintly. I'm sure it does. But Mrs. Miller is mistaken. This is parcel 7B. It's not part of Lakeside Estates. My family has owned it since '67. I spoke with Mrs. Miller about this already. The older surveyor looked me up and down, then squinted back toward the main road. We just do the work we're paid for, pal. If you have a dispute, you need to take it up with the HOA. They're the client. I could see this was a battle I wouldn't win with them. They were just subcontractors. All right, I said, holding my hands up in a gesture of peace. Let me make this simple for you. You're currently trespassing. I'm asking you politely to remove your stakes and leave my property. If you don't, my next call will be to the sheriff, and I'll be giving him your company's name. The younger man looked nervous, but the older one just grunted. Fine by me. We get paid for the day either way, he said to his partner. Pack it up, Jimmy. Let the woman with the clipboard sort it out. I watched them pack their gear and leave, pulling their stakes out of the ground as they went. I knew this was far from over. Karen was testing the waters, and I had pushed back. Now she would escalate. I started my own file that day. I created a new folder on my laptop labeled simply HOA and saved the photo of my letter in their mailbox. I wrote a detailed account of the encounter with the surveyors, including their company's name, the date, and the time. Documentation, as an architectural historian, was second nature to me. Every detail, every correspondence, every event. I knew I would need it. The very next day, a Saturday, Karen appeared at my property line, this time with an audience. She had 2 other HOA board members with her, a meek-looking man named Bob who seemed terrified of her, and a woman who looked like a slightly less polished version of Karen herself. Karen stood with her hands on her hips, pointing. You see? She said to them, just loud enough for me to hear from my porch. This is what I'm talking about. His hostility. He threatened the surveyors yesterday. Threatened them. I walked down the lawn to meet them at the edge of the woods. Karen, I said, my voice even. I didn't threaten anyone. I informed them that they were trespassing on my private property and that I would call law enforcement if they didn't leave, which they did, because they knew I was right. Karen scoffed. This is not your property. It's a community access way. It's been used for years. People have been using a deer path on my property for a couple of years. Yes, I countered. My permission for that informal use doesn't magically create a public easement or cede my land to your association. That's not how property law works. The second woman, whose name I later learned was Cynthia, chimed in. Well, it seems awfully unneighborly of you to block access to the lake for all the families here. I haven't blocked anything, I replied, gesturing to the faint path. People can still walk there. I'm simply stating the fact that I'm not allowing you to bring in machinery and build a gravel highway through my land. It's not happening. Karen's face was turning a blotchy red. We'll see about that. Our lawyer will be in touch. We have rights. The community has rights. It was like arguing with a toddler who had just learned a new word. She kept repeating community rights, as if it were an incantation that could bend reality to her will. As they turned to leave, Bob, the meek one, lingered for a second and gave me a small, almost imperceptible shrug, as if to say, sorry, she's crazy. It was a tiny crack in her armor, the first sign that not everyone in her kingdom was a loyal subject. That night, I pulled out the old metal box where my grandfather kept his records. The original survey, the deed, the title insurance documents. I spread them out on the heavy oak dining table. The language in the deed was crystal clear. It described the property's boundaries with metes and bounds, referencing iron pins and old oak trees. There was no mention of any easement, right-of-way, or public access path. 0. I also took another walk, this time with a high-powered flashlight and my phone. I found the original survey markers my grandfather had installed. One was an iron pin near the road, nearly swallowed by the roots of a maple tree. The other was a concrete monument down by the shoreline. Using the compass app on my phone and the bearings from the old survey, I could trace the line. The path was, without a shadow of a doubt, entirely on my side of the line. Karen wasn't just wrong, she was spectacularly wrong. The confidence with which she asserted her claims was staggering. It wasn't just about a path anymore. It was about her refusal to accept that her authority ended where my property began. My quiet cabin had become the front line in a war against her suburban tyranny, and I was starting to realize that a polite letter wasn't going to be enough. I needed to prepare for a siege. My grandfather was a man of belts and suspenders. He believed in redundancies, in checking your work twice, and in possessing irrefutable proof before you ever opened your mouth to state a fact as such. That philosophy was about to become my guiding principle. Arguing with Karen was like trying to nail Jell-O to a wall. She was immune to logic and reason. Therefore, I decided to stop arguing entirely. My new focus would be on building a case so airtight, so overwhelmingly documented, that her opinions would become irrelevant. My work as an architectural historian had trained me in the art of the deep dive. I spent my days sifting through dusty archives, county records offices, and forgotten church basements to piece together the history of a structure. Applying this skill set to my own property felt like coming home. The first step was to digitize everything. I carefully scanned every document my grandfather had saved. The 1967 deed, the original survey map with the county surveyor's embossed seal, the title report, even old tax bills that showed the property lines. I compiled these into a single organized PDF file, a digital fortress of facts. But I couldn't rely solely on documents that were over 50 years old. I needed a modern confirmation. I went to the county records office, a place I was intimately familiar with from my professional work. The clerk, a wonderful woman named Marge, with whom I'd spent many hours discussing the finer points of 19th century land grants, greeted me warmly. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said, peering over her glasses. "Here to dig up some more dirt on an old building? Something like that, Marge?" I said, smiling. But this time, it's personal. I explained the situation, careful to frame it as a simple boundary query, rather than a full-blown neighbor dispute. Marge listened intently, tapping a pen on her desk. When I mentioned Lakeside Estates and Karen Miller's name, she rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck. "Ah, Mrs. Miller," she sighed. "She's persistent. She's been in here 3 times demanding copies of the master plan, convinced there are hidden community properties sprinkled all over the place. Seems to think being HOA president gives her the key to the city." Marge's casual confirmation was invigorating. Karen wasn't just targeting me. She was on a crusade, and the county officials were already aware of her antics. Marge pulled the official plat map for the Lakeside Estates subdivision. We spread it out on a large light table. It was a sea of neatly drawn lots, cul-de-sacs, and designated common areas, all rendered in crisp black ink. And there, on the western edge, was my property, clearly delineated and labeled Parcel 7B, not a part of this plat. The line was thick and unambiguous. There was no easement, no dotted line indicating a trail, no mention of any community access across my land. "There's your answer right there," Marge said, tapping the map. "Clear as day. Her authority stops at that line. Anything she claims beyond that is just wishful thinking." I asked for a certified copy of the plat map, which Marge was happy to provide, stamping it with a satisfying thud. While I was there, I had another idea. "Marge, could you pull the Articles of Incorporation and the bylaws for the Lakeside Estates HOA?" An HOA is a corporation, and its governing documents are a matter of public record. Marge grinned. "Now you're thinking. Let's see what kind of power she's actually given herself." We found them easily. I spent the next hour sitting at a carrel, reading through the dense legalese. I was looking for anything that might give Karen even a sliver of justification. There was nothing. In fact, I found the opposite. Article 4, Section 2 clearly stated that the HOA's jurisdiction was limited to the properties described within the Lakeside Estates plat, and any future annexations approved by a majority vote of the membership. My land had never been annexed. Furthermore, Article 9, Section 5, under the heading Duties and Powers of the Board, explicitly stated that the board could only authorize expenditures for work on HOA common property. Paying surveyors to mark a trail on my land wasn't just an overreach. It was a potential misuse of HOA funds. This was more than a smoking gun. It was a whole arsenal. I now had certified, contemporary proof from the county that my property was separate, and I had the HOA's own governing documents proving that Karen was acting outside the scope of her authority. The next piece of my strategy was surveillance. The laminated notes had stopped, but the passive aggression had ramped up. Twice, I found small piles of dog waste just on my side of the property line along the path. Another time, someone had tied garish yellow ribbons around the trees along the trail on my land, as if to mark their territory. It was petty, childish, and impossible to prove who was doing it, but I had my suspicions. I purchased and installed 4 high-resolution, motion-activated security cameras. They weren't cheap, but I considered them an investment in my sanity. 2 were mounted discreetly on trees overlooking the path in question. Another covered my porch and back patio, and the 4th had a wide view of my driveway and the edge of my property bordering the street. I made no effort to hide the cameras on the cabin itself. In fact, I wanted them to be seen. A visible camera is a powerful deterrent to bad behavior. It was during this period of quiet evidence gathering that I gained an unexpected ally. One evening, as I was returning from a walk, I saw Bob, the meek HOA board member, retrieving his mail. He saw me and gave a hesitant wave. On an impulse, I walked over. "Bob, got a minute?" He looked around nervously, as if Karen might pop out from behind a manicured shrub. "Sure, what's up?" "I just want to be clear about something," I said calmly. "I'm not trying to cause trouble for the neighborhood. I just want to be left alone and for the HOA to respect my property lines. That's it." Bob sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Look," he said in a low voice, "I know. We know. I've seen the plat maps." She showed them at a meeting, trying to point out some ambiguity that just wasn't there. "A couple of us on the board know she's in the wrong, but she's very persuasive. And she'll make life miserable for anyone who crosses her. She's spending HOA money to harass a non-member," I stated plainly. "She hired surveyors to come onto my land. That's a liability issue for the association. For you." He paled slightly. "I know. I argued against it, but she pushed the vote through when 2 other members were on vacation. Said it was for legal discovery. It was the confirmation I needed. Not only was Karen acting unilaterally, but there was internal dissent. Bob wasn't an enemy, he was a captive. Just be careful," he said before scurrying back to his house. "She's been talking to the HOA's lawyer, trying to build a case for prescriptive easement. She's convinced that because people have been walking there for a couple of years, the trail now legally belongs to the community. A prescriptive easement, it was a long-shot legal argument, but a nuisance nonetheless. It requires that the use of the land be hostile, open, and notorious for a statutory period, which in our state was 20 years. 2 years of a few people using a deer path didn't come close to meeting that standard, but the fact that she was even pursuing this angle showed her dedication. She wasn't going to give up. The knowledge that she was consulting a lawyer prompted me to do the same. I didn't need representation yet, but I wanted a professional opinion. I found a highly regarded real estate attorney in the next town over and paid for an hour of his time. I laid out my file on his conference table, the deeds, the surveys, new and old, the HOA bylaws, my timeline of events. He listened patiently, examined the documents, and then leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said with a slight grin, "it's not often I get a case this clean-cut. You're 100% in the right. She has no legal leg to stand on. None. The prescriptive easement argument is laughable. Keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. The cameras are a great idea. Don't engage with her directly. Communicate only in writing." Then he gave me the piece of advice that would become the cornerstone of my final strategy. "The thing about people like this," he said, "is that they build their entire identity around this petty power. The only way to beat them is not just to prove them wrong, but to do it in a way that dismantles the source of that power. In her case, it's the HOA board and the opinion of her neighbors. A public defeat is the only language she'll understand. I left his office feeling validated and armed. I had the facts, the law, and a strategy. Now, all I had to do was wait for Karen to make her next move. I didn't have to wait long. She was about to escalate things to a level that even I, in my most cynical moments, hadn't anticipated. The final phase began, as so many suburban conflicts do, with a fence. Having established with absolute certainty where my property line was, and with my lawyer's advice echoing in my mind, I decided a clear, physical demarcation was the next logical step. It wasn't born of spite, but of a desire for an end to ambiguity. I hired a reputable local fencing company, the same one, I noted with some irony, that had installed the pristine white vinyl fences around most of the Lakeside Estates properties. I didn't want a spite fence, some ugly, towering barrier. I chose a tasteful, 4-foot-high split-rail fence. The kind that says, countryside charm, more than keep out. It was aesthetically pleasing and perfectly in keeping with the rustic character of my cabin. Crucially, I had the company's foreman walk the line with me, my certified plat map in hand, ensuring that every single post would be planted a good 12 inches inside my property line. There would be no question that this fence was mine and on my land. The day the work crew arrived was a day of high drama for the neighborhood. It was as if I had commissioned a jousting tournament on my lawn. Neighbors I'd never spoken to suddenly found urgent reasons to be trimming their hedges or checking their mail, their gazes lingering on the auger and the stacks of cedar rails. And then, like a moth to a flame, Karen arrived. Her white Range Rover screeched to a halt at the end of my driveway. She got out, phone already pressed to her ear, and marched toward the foreman, a man named Dave with a thick neck and a patient expression that suggested he'd dealt with his share of Karens before. I watched the scene unfold from my porch, my new favorite vantage point. My camera overlooking the driveway was recording everything in glorious HD. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, loud enough for the entire cul-de-sac to hear. "You cannot build a fence here. This is community property." Dave, the foreman, barely looked up from his clipboard. "Ma'am, the homeowner has provided us with a certified plat map from the county. We're installing the fence entirely within his property line. We're a foot inside it. To be precise, that map is wrong," she shrieked. "I am the president of the Homeowners Association, and I am telling you that you are blocking a designated community trail. You are to cease all work immediately." Dave finally gave her his full attention. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your title doesn't mean anything to me. I have a contract with my client, the legal property owner. Unless you can produce a court order telling me to stop, my men and I are going to build this fence." This was a level of direct, unimpressed dismissal that Karen was clearly unaccustomed to. Her face went from red to a pale, tight-lipped fury. She jabbed a finger toward the cabin. "He is creating a hazard. People need to access the lake. What if there's an emergency? An ambulance needs to get down there," she yelled, her argument becoming more frantic and unhinged. "This fence will block emergency access." Dave just pointed down the road. "Ma'am, there's a community boat ramp and a public beach less than half a mile that way. I'm pretty sure emergency services will figure it out." Defeated by logic, Karen retreated to her car, but not before snapping a dozen photos of the work crew with her phone. She sat in her Range Rover for 20 minutes, furiously texting. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was spinning her narrative, reporting to her loyal subjects about my latest outrage, my illegal fence, my hostile attitude. The fence went up over the next 2 days. It was beautiful. It followed the gentle contours of the land, weaving through the trees. It had one single 5-foot-wide gate, positioned right where the old deer path was. I put a simple, unlocked slide bolt on it. My goal was not to completely bar access, but to control it, to make it unequivocally clear that passage through that gate was a privilege, not a right. I also put up a small, professionally made sign on the gate. It read, Private property. Trail access permitted for Lakeside Estates residents. Please respect the land and close the gate behind you. Surveillance in use. I was being more than reasonable. I was providing a clear boundary, a single point of entry, and a polite set of rules. For a normal person, this would have been the end of it. For Karen, it was a declaration of war. She couldn't stand the sight of that fence, the physical monument to her failure. She couldn't stand the sign, which tacitly acknowledged my ownership while generously permitting her residents access. Her entire campaign was built on the lie that the land was hers to command, and my fence and sign peacefully, elegantly, proved it was not. Her retribution came 3 days later. It was a Saturday morning. I was on the porch, enjoying that first cup of coffee, the lake calm and misty. I saw her marching up my driveway. She wasn't alone. She had Bob, the reluctant board member, and Cynthia, her loyal deputy, in tow. They looked like a grim suburban firing squad. I remained seated, sipping my coffee. She stopped at the bottom of my porch steps, her hands on her hips. Cynthia stood slightly behind her, clutching a clipboard like a shield. Bob lingered a few feet back, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. "We need to talk," Karen announced. Her tone was sharp, imperial. "I'm listening," I said without getting up. "This," she said, waving a hand dramatically at the new fence, "is a flagrant violation of the community's rights and a serious safety hazard. We have had a special meeting of the board." I noticed she didn't mention it was a meeting of only 3 of them. "And we have voted. You are to provide the HOA with a key to that gate." I almost laughed. "A key? It's a slide bolt, Karen. It's not locked." "Don't be obtuse," she snapped. "We have also determined that we require access to the property for maintenance and emergencies. Therefore, we will also require you to provide the association with a key to your cabin." This was it. The pinnacle of her entitlement. The final, glorious overreach. My mind flashed to my lawyer's advice. Let them dismantle themselves in public. I set my coffee mug down carefully. "Let me see if I have this straight. You want a key to my private home?" "For emergency access only, of course," Cynthia chimed in quickly, reading from a script on her clipboard. "The HOA has a duty to ensure the safety and accessibility of all common and bordering areas." "My cabin is not a common or bordering area," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "And under no circumstances will I be giving you or anyone in your association a key to my house. That is an absurd and insane request." Karen's face hardened. "It's not a request. It's a formal demand from the board. If you refuse to comply, you will be in violation, and we will take further action." I stood up slowly. "The answer is no. Now, I'd like the 3 of you to leave my property." For a moment, she was stunned into silence. She truly believed her position gave her the power to make such a demand. My flat refusal was not part of her script. Then the rage took over. "I am not leaving until you hand over those keys," she screeched. "This property is more of a community asset than a private home, and you are acting with reckless disregard for your neighbors." "My neighbors?" I said, looking pointedly at Bob, who flinched. "Are welcome to use the path through the gate. You, however, are not welcome on my porch. Leave. Now." And that's when she did it. She pulled out her phone, her hands trembling with fury, and stabbed at the screen. "You want to be difficult? Fine." She held the phone up to her ear. "Yes, I need to report a hostile individual. 911. My name is Karen Miller. I'm the HOA president at Lakeside Estates." Her voice shifted into that of a terrified victim. "There's a man here, on community property, who is blocking emergency access and acting very aggressively. I'm afraid of what he might do. Please send officers immediately. He's trespassing and refusing to leave." The lie was so blatant, so theatrical, it was almost a work of art. She was standing on my porch, demanding keys to my home, and telling the police that I was the trespasser. I simply pulled out my own phone, which had been discreetly recording audio since she started her march up my driveway, and held it up. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, on my own land, waiting for the final act to begin. The wail of a siren, distant at first, then rapidly growing closer, cut through the morning calm. It was a jarring sound in this quiet corner of the lake, a sound of crisis and emergency that felt utterly disconnected from the scene on my porch. Karen wore a look of smug triumph, a slight, victorious curl to her lip. She had summoned the cavalry. She truly believed that the arrival of uniformed officers would be the ultimate validation of her authority, that they would act as her personal enforcement arm, compelling me to bend to her will. Cynthia, her acolyte, stood beside her, looking righteous and firm. Bob, meanwhile, looked physically ill. He had backed away from the porch steps and was now hovering near a birch tree, wringing his hands and avoiding eye contact with anyone. He knew this was a terrible misstep, a line crossed from which there was no easy return. I remained standing on my porch, my demeanor calm, my mind running through a checklist. My phone was still recording audio. The camera overlooking the porch was recording video. And in my office, just inside the sliding glass door, was the file. My case, bound and tabbed, ready for presentation. This wasn't a moment of panic for me. It was the moment of culmination. Everything had led to this. 2 deputies from the county sheriff department pulled into my driveway. They were professionals. Their movements were deliberate and calm as they exited their vehicle. One was older, with a graying mustache and the weary but watchful eyes of a man who had seen it all. The other was younger, fit, and observant. The older deputy, whose name tag read Harrison, took the lead. "Morning, folks," he said, his voice neutral. "We got a call about a disturbance, a trespass issue?" Karen immediately sprang into action, rushing toward them. "Oh, thank God you're here, officer," she gushed, her voice thick with manufactured distress. "This man," she pointed a dramatic finger at me, "is refusing to leave community property. He's built this illegal fence to block access, and now he's becoming hostile and aggressive. I'm the HOA president, and frankly, I'm concerned for the safety of the community." Deputy Harrison looked from Karen's flushed, agitated face to me. I was standing perfectly still on my own porch, my hands visible and empty. He gave me a slow, measured look. "And you are, sir?" "I'm the owner of this property," I said calmly. "And you're standing in my driveway." Harrison's gaze flickered around, taking in the cabin, the new fence, the quiet setting. His expression didn't change, but I could see the gears turning. The scene didn't quite match the frantic, hostile man report he'd received. "All right," he said, turning back to Karen. "Ma'am, you're saying this gentleman is trespassing?" "Yes, exactly," Karen exclaimed. "He refuses to leave. We've asked him repeatedly. The HOA board has determined this area, including the porch, is a common access point." I saw the younger deputy's eyebrows twitch upward for just a fraction of a second. The idea that a man's own porch was community property was clearly a new one to him. "And you're the owner of this property?" Harrison asked me again, just to be sure. "I am," I confirmed. "I have the deed right inside, along with the certified county plat map if you'd like to see them." "He's lying," Karen interjected. "He's using forged documents. We have the real maps. The community has rights." Harrison held up a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, please let me handle this. One person at a time." He turned back to me. "Sir, why don't you go ahead and get that paperwork for me?" "I'd be happy to," I said. I turned and walked into the cabin, leaving the glass door open. I could hear Karen's voice, insistent and grating, trying to press her case with the younger deputy. "You have to understand. He is a danger to this community. His uncooperative nature is a liability. We formally requested keys to his cabin for emergency access, and he refused. That's when he became aggressive." I returned with the folder. It was a simple, thick, black 3-ring binder. I had labeled the spine Parcel 7B, Property Records. I handed it to Deputy Harrison. "It's all in there," I said. "Tab A is the certified copy of the current county plat map, showing this parcel is not part of the Lakeside Estates plat. Tab B is the original 1967 deed. Tab C is the Lakeside Estates HOA's own Articles of Incorporation, which define their jurisdiction. And Tab D is a legal opinion from my attorney confirming my property rights. Deputy Harrison took the binder. He opened it and began to read, leaning against the hood of his patrol car. The younger deputy stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. Karen watched them, a smug expression on her face, as if she were a prosecutor, watching a jury review damning evidence against the defendant. She clearly believed the sheer force of her personality and her title would outweigh any documents I produced. There was a long silence, broken only by the chirping of birds and the quiet rustle of paper as Harrison turned the pages. He read carefully, methodically. He compared the plat map in my binder to the image on the tablet in his car. He read the articles of incorporation. He glanced at the lawyer's letter. After about 5 minutes, which felt like an eternity, he closed the binder. He looked up, his gaze finding Karen. His expression was no longer neutral. It was one of profound, weary annoyance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat. "According to these official county records, this entire property, including the porch you're standing next to and the land this fence is on, belongs to this gentleman. It is not, and never has been, part of the Lakeside Estates HOA. Karen's face fell. The triumphant smirk dissolved into a mask of disbelief. "What? That's impossible. That can't be right. Our records. Your records are incorrect," Harrison stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. "This binder contains certified legal documents. What you have are opinions. This is his private property." He then turned to me. "Sir, I see from the documentation and from your own sign on that gate that you've been more than reasonable in allowing path access." "I've tried to be," I said. Harrison nodded, then fixed his gaze back on Karen. And this is when the true beauty of the moment began to unfold. "Ma'am, we received a 911 call reporting a hostile, trespassing individual. Based on all the actual evidence here, the only person trespassing is you. And your associates." He gestured toward Cynthia and the wilting Bob. Cynthia gasped, clutching her clipboard to her chest as if it could ward off the law. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his voice growing sterner, "you called 911, an emergency line, to report a fabricated story. You claimed this man was hostile and aggressive when, by all appearances and by his own audio recording of your interaction." He paused for dramatic effect, letting that sink in. "He has been calm, and you have been the one making demands and yelling. Ma'am, making a false police report is a criminal offense." Karen's face had gone completely white. She looked from the deputy to me, to my phone, her mind frantically trying to process how her brilliant power play had just blown up in her face. I was concerned," she stammered. "It was an emergency. He's blocking access." The younger deputy, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "Ma'am, for whom is he blocking access? The fence is on his land, and he's allowed people through a gate. And what was this about demanding keys to his house?" Karen seemed to shrink. For the HOA, for maintenance, for emergencies." Deputy Harrison sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, you cannot demand keys to a private residence. The HOA is not a government body. It's a neighborhood club. You have zero authority to do that. In fact, demanding access to his home under threat of further action could be construed as attempted coercion." He turned to me. "Sir," he said, his tone shifting to one of polite formality, "since they are on your property against your wishes, and since you have asked them to leave and they have refused, do you wish for them to be formally trespassed?" The tables had not just turned, they had been flipped over, dismantled, and set on fire. The power to summon law enforcement, which Karen believed was her ultimate weapon, was now being offered to me. I looked at Karen. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of fear and pure, undiluted fury. Her reign was over, and she knew it. This was the public defeat my lawyer had talked about. In front of law enforcement, in front of her board members, and in front of any curious neighbors who were still watching, her authority had been exposed as a complete fiction. I thought for a moment. Having them arrested felt like too much. Humiliation was a far more effective and lasting punishment. "No, deputy," I said clearly. "That won't be necessary. I don't want to press charges." I paused, then looked directly at Karen, Bob, and Cynthia. I just want them to leave my property, and to never, ever come back. The finality in my voice seemed to hang in the air. Leave, and never come back. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a verdict. Deputy Harrison nodded, seemingly satisfied with my decision. It was a de-escalation, but one that cemented my complete control of the situation. He turned to Karen, his expression stern and official. You heard the man. He is the legal property owner, and he has revoked your privilege to be here. I want you, and you, he pointed at Cynthia and then Bob, to leave this property immediately. Do not return. If the sheriff's department receives another call to this address regarding you being on this property, you will be arrested for trespassing. Do you understand me? Cynthia, looking utterly scandalized, grabbed Karen's arm as if to protest, but Karen just shook her head, her face a pale, grim mask of fury. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. Without another word, she turned on her heel and marched stiffly toward her Range Rover, a queen retreating from a lost battle. Cynthia scurried after her. Bob, however, paused. He looked at the deputies, then at me. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was a complex gesture, part apology, part acknowledgement, part relief. Then he turned and walked quickly down the driveway, not toward Karen's car, but in the opposite direction, toward his own house. The rift in the HOA board was now a public chasm. As the Range Rover sped away with a spray of gravel, Deputy Harrison handed me back my binder. You've got a good, solid case here, sir, he said. My advice? Get a restraining order. It'll be easy to get given this false report. It adds another layer of legal protection and sends a very clear message. I thanked him and his partner for their professionalism. As they were about to leave, Harrison turned back one last time. And for what it's worth, he said with a slight shake of his head, in 20 years of doing this, the HOA needs a key to my cabin is a new one. Stay safe. I watched them drive away, and then there was silence again. The beautiful, ordinary silence of a Saturday morning at the lake. It had been shattered by sirens and shouting, and now it was restored. The victory felt quiet, but immense. It wasn't just about a fence or a path. It was about the fundamental right to peace and privacy in one's own home. Following the deputy's advice, I contacted my lawyer on Monday morning. He was ecstatic when I recounted the weekend's events, especially the 911 call and my audio recording. As he'd predicted, Karen's public overreach was her undoing. He filed for a temporary restraining order on my behalf that very day, citing the harassment, the false police report, and the unnerving demand for keys to my home. A judge granted it immediately. Karen was legally forbidden from setting foot on my property, contacting me, or coming within 100 yards of me or my cabin. The order was served to her by a process server at her home that evening. The fallout in the Lakeside Estates community was swift and glorious. Bob, emboldened by Karen's public humiliation, resigned from the HOA board immediately, issuing a community-wide email explaining his reasons. He cited the president's reckless and unauthorized actions, the misuse of HOA funds on personal vendettas, and the potential legal exposure for the entire association. He attached a copy of my fence, signed the polite one, and asked his neighbors if that looked like the work of a hostile, uncooperative individual. The community forum, which Karen had always ruled with an iron fist, erupted. People who had been afraid to speak up before were suddenly finding their voices. Stories of her other petty tyrannies emerged. Fines for holiday decorations left up a day too long, nasty notes about basketball hoops, demands that people repaint their mailboxes a slightly different shade of black. My quiet struggle had, it turned out, been just one front in a larger war that many of my neighbors had been fighting in silence. The audio recording of Karen's unhinged demands on my porch, which a concerned board member, I have my suspicions it was Bob, leaked to the community forum, was the nail in her coffin. Hearing her shrieking about her rights to my keys and her fabricated 911 call was undeniable. A special meeting of the homeowners was called. It was held in the community clubhouse, and I heard from several sources that it was a packed house. Karen, stripped of her authority by the restraining order and her credibility by her own words, was overwhelmingly voted out as president and removed from the board entirely. Cynthia, her loyal follower, resigned in disgrace before she could be voted out. A new board was elected, a group of reasonable people who seemed more interested in maintaining the streetlights than in inspecting their neighbors' grills. One of their first official acts was to issue a formal, written apology to me on behalf of the Lakeside Estates HOA for the actions of the previous board. They acknowledged my property rights and affirmed that the path through my land was a privilege, not a right. I accepted their apology. Peace was restored. The new fence stands as a quiet, pleasant-looking reminder of the importance of clear boundaries. Residents still use the path, now more respectfully than ever. They wave as they pass. They close the gate. The little sign I posted remains, a symbol not of division, but of mutual respect born from a battle that should never have had to be fought. Sometimes I sit on my porch, a cup of coffee in my hand, and look out over the lake. I think about my grandfather and his meticulous records. He knew that a man's land was his own, and that the lines on a map were more than just ink. They were a promise of sanctuary. Karen tried to erase that promise with bullying and bluster. But she made a fatal error that so many people like her make. She mistook patience for weakness, and she fundamentally underestimated an opponent who had done his homework. She came at me with laminated notes and a sense of entitlement, and I met her with certified documents, high-resolution video, and the unshakable foundation of the law. She brought a tantrum to a title fight, and she was resoundingly defeated. And the best part of all is the quiet. The profound, beautiful, and hard-won quiet of my grandfather's cabin, now and forever mine.